For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joshua Shifrinson. I'm a first-year assistant professor here. I teach classes in American foreign policy and international relations. So it's appropriate today to present to you some of my research, a working manuscript I have entitled Dilemmas of Decline, Risks of Rise, Rising States, and Great Power Decline. And the project as a whole is founded on one empirical observation and a couple of empirical puzzles. So the empirical observation is this. Even though we think of the post-1945, the post-World War II world as one of overarching stability in the balance of power, there's actually been a lot of fundamental change in the distribution of power. One such change occurred at the end of World War II itself, when the multipolar system that had defined world politics since Westphalia gave way pretty rapidly to a period of bipolarity between the US and the USSR, as Britain, one of the three victors in World War II, fell from the great power ranks. The second change occurred at the end of the Cold War itself, when bipolarity, the period characterized by US-Soviet relations, gave way to what Charles Krauthammer called the unipolar moment, which may or may not still be with us today. So the empirical observation is there's been lots of change in the distribution of power, even though the American position has been one of overarching strength. And the puzzle is this. What do we expect the US or any rising state to do in these periods of change? And we can think about it in terms of American strategy and the decline of the USSR. So as you all may know, the USSR declined from 1989 to 1991, rapidly fell from the great power ranks. So that Europe, which looked like this in 1988, you can see the two blocks, the two superpower blocks, the Soviet bloc in red and the American bloc in blue, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact standing off against each other, quickly gave way to something that looks like this. A couple of noticeable differences. That whole red bloc, the Warsaw Pact, is just gone. And the USSR itself is just vanished from the map of the world, right? We see a couple of smaller states, which of those of you who have been following the Ukraine issue is still with us today. So the puzzle is this. What do you expect the US to do? Well, if you're Ken Waltz, this is a great moment to declare victory in the Cold War and pull your troops home. If you're John Eikenberry, this is a great moment to build institutions, to integrate the former Soviet adversary into your institutional network. And if you're John Mearsheimer, this is an opportunity to slice the Soviet throat and push them from the great power ranks. But I'm going to say that the US did none of these things. In fact, what we find is that American policy in 1989 through 1991, the period encapsulated by the H.W. Bush administration, the namesake for this institution, went through three phases. In the first phase, from 1988 to 1989, or roughly encompassing 1989, we saw an effort by the United States to encourage slow and steady change in the Soviet bloc, to gradually weaken the Soviet hold on Eastern Europe. Now, in the winter of 1990, that turned on a dime as the US pushed German reunification inside of NATO with no regard for Soviet interests and rolled the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. And then in 1991, as the USSR itself is on its last legs, we see American strategy pull itself back again. And instead of cutting the Soviet throat, we try to encourage a slow, steady landing. And so my puzzle is, what explains this variation? To give you a flavor, so that brings me to the central research questions of this exercise. I ask very simply, when a great power declines, what strategies do other relatively rising states adopt? When and why do they pursue predatory strategies, try to push declining states down or from the great power ranks to weaken them? And why do we see efforts to support great powers, such as the Anglo-American alliance post-World War II? Why do we see efforts by some rising states to prop up declining great powers? And not just what strategies do these states adopt, but why do these strategies change across time and space, both in type and in degree? To give you and this literature also helps fill in a theoretical gap on decline's consequences, because scholarship on the consequences of great power decline is fundamentally mixed. Scholars such as Organsky and Mearsheimer claim that decline leads to rising state predation fairly monolithically. On the other hand, scholars such as Randy Schweller and Celeste Wallander, John Eikenberry, claim that decline is conditional when you see institutions or similar domestic regimes where actually you're expected to see surprising amounts of rising state support and cooperation. And finally, you have scholars such as Joe McDonald and Paul Parent, who claim that declining states often recover their place within the great power rankings. All of which is to say, there's lots of under-theorized variation in the consequences of great power decline. And lest you think I'm just spitting into the ether here, predation during decline is a going concern in the United States, particularly given fears of the decline of the US and the relative rise of China. Some famous images kind of just encapsulate the growing concern in the scholarly and popular press. Before I go further, I should say that by decline, I mean the sustained loss of economic and military capabilities from one state relative to another. Just a very quick conceptualization, decline is relative. And to give you a preview of my answer, I argue that rising states ask themselves a very simple question when confronted with a declining great power. They ask, what does the distribution of power look like? And how important is the declining state to the maintenance of a coherent balance of power? And the choice between predation or support hinges on the polarity of the international system, the number of other great powers, and the declining state's own military posture. Now that last variable is very important because it means even within the structural confines, the declining state gets a vote in its own fate. Very important caveat. So what am I going to do? Having given you an introduction to my project, I'm going to walk you through the dependent variable, some of the existing arguments, and go into detail on my argument. I'll talk about my research design, although I'll go into more detail about US policy and the decline of the USSR, and then I'll step back to talk about implications throughout international relations theory and current policy debates. So what do we got? Well, the dependent variable of my study are the strategies of rising states, rising great powers. And by strategy, I simply mean a political military ends-means chain adopted to structure relations with a declining state. How does the rising state aim to accommodate or not accommodate the declining state? And this strategy can vary along two dimensions. One dimension are the goals sought by the rising state. Here, very simply, does a rising state aim to eliminate a declining state as a great power, or do they aim to preserve the declining state as a strong member of the international system? Okay, so two basic goals. But we all know that goals don't just, you have to invest something into goals, right? Well, goals don't exist in the ether. So the second dimension are the means used, right? And does the rising state use cautious means? Do they slowly try to pursue these goals by using cautious, limited investments of time, energy, and resources? Or do they invest all their resources, all their effort in an all-out surge to change or not change or stabilize the distribution of power? Now, any good political scientist will tell you that the holy grail of research is a 2x2. So this gives me a 2x2 for my dependent variable. Rising state goals on one axis, rising state means on the other. When you have the goal of eliminating a declining state using any and all means at the rising state's disposal, this leads to a strategy that I call extreme predation, characterized by efforts to rapidly push the declining state from the great power ranks. Indicators here are war, the desire to strip a declining state of allies, to isolate the declining state, to engage in economic warfare, things that are costly for the declining state to counter and aim to change the distribution of power in pretty direct fashion. On the other hand, you can still aim to try to eliminate a declining state, but not really using all the assets at your disposal. This leads to a strategy of what I call moderate predation. Indicators here are efforts to arms race, to make it difficult for the declining state to maintain an equitable distribution of power, to refuse to engage in negotiations over disputed interests, or if you are going to negotiate, to offer asymmetric demands, things that aim to slowly shift the distribution of power and the distribution of rights in the international system in the rising state's favor at the declining state's expense. What about the other side of the equation? Well, when you want to preserve a declining state, but you're not sure how much you're going to pay for the privilege, that leads to a strategy that I call moderate support. Here, you might see efforts to give symbolic or token political backing, maybe a kind word in the United Nations, to provide limited economic aid, to maybe engage in arms control or ending an arms race, things that try to slow shifts in the distribution of power, symbolize that you're interested in preserving a declining state, but don't do much in an actual substantive sense to preserve the declining state as a great power. And finally, when you want to preserve a declining state and you're willing to devote almost anything to the privilege, you get what I call a strategy of extreme support. Examples here are giving diplomatic guarantees, giving an alliance, indicating that you're willing to go to war for the privilege of preserving a declining state, to provide large-scale resource transfers. Everyone remembers the Marshall Plan. That's an effort to stabilize Great Britain's role in the post-war distribution of power. and as I said before, offering an alliance. So the 2x2 holy grail of a rising state strategy towards declining great powers. Now, what explains variation? Well, I'm going to argue that existing explanations are fairly incomplete. Realist arguments, for example, lack a baseline prediction. Classical and offensive realism, as I mentioned, suggest that rising states want to just pursue power. Structural realist arguments say rising states pursue security without telling you what that security looks like. And offense-defense arguments, some of you who are in IR theory really know offense-defense theory, suggest that the balance of power should, or rising state strategy should move slowly over time as these big lumpy variables move slowly over time. Whether it's easier to attack or defend changes slowly. Well, that's fine, except I'm going to show you that, as I said, rising states sometimes support declining great powers, and they often change strategies in very short windows of time, suggesting these big lumpy explanations are fairly incomplete. And at the same time, liberal theories, such as regime arguments, institutionalist arguments, had trouble explaining why even states with similar regimes and in those states that are embedded in the same institutions oftentimes still see strategic shifts across time and space, and sometimes even pursue predatory strategies. And I'm going to come back to these arguments in just a few. In contrast, I argue that rising states indeed seek power. In that regard, classical realists are correct, but that the structure of the international system itself imposes limits on how far that behavior can go. And that depending upon the costs and benefits of predation, rising state strategy moves across time and space. And as I mentioned a while ago, these costs and benefits are shaped by the polarity of the international system and the declining state's own military posture, its own military choices. Now, the benefit of predation should be fairly straightforward, right? The rising state grows relatively stronger. Power is good for security. Power can buy you goodies in international negotiations. So getting strength is good. But there are some pretty severe costs you can imagine a rising state might pay if it tries slicing a declining state's throat. There are three possible costs as I think of it. First, might end up in a war. Declining states are great powers for a reason. They have lots of assets at their disposal. And if a rising state gets too grabby, too punchy too soon, the declining state can choose to engage in preventive action to stop or halt the rising state's growth. Second, a rising state that preys upon a declining state might lead to a counterbalancing coalition. Other states may swing to the declining state's side, try to help prop it up. And it might engender a counterbalancing coalition that can halt or slow the rising state's rise entirely. And finally, if a rising state is foresighted, thinks about the future of the international system, a rising state may wind up losing out on the declining state as a future ally. International politics is inherently uncertain. And if a rising state eliminates a declining state today, it can't work with that state in the future against possible unknown future threats. Now, these possible costs aren't constant, as I have mentioned several times. So let me unpack how I think polarity and posture shape these costs. Again, polarity, I mean the number of great powers, and I code this in the share of GDP, gross domestic product, and the composite index of national capability scores from the correlates of war data set. If anyone wants to push my methodology, you're more than welcome to do so in Q&A. Please don't. The logic of bipolarity, so I distinguish between two types of polar systems, right? Bipolar and multipolar systems. Bipolar systems with 2 great powers, multipolar systems with 3 or more great powers. Well, in bipolar systems, the rising state is rising and the declining state is declining. In this system, each of the 2 states is the principal threat to the other, meaning that the rising state can incorporate a period of unipolarity and pretty much ensure its own security and far into perpetuity if it can eliminate the declining state as a great power. As a result, the rising state doesn't need to worry about counterbalancing coalitions, nor does the declining state have value as a future ally. In this situation, the only thing keeping the rising state in check is the fear of war. Yet if the rising state can eliminate the declining state without engendering war, it can incorporate unipolarity. As a result, the desire to eliminate threats to one's survival encourages predatory policies and bipolarity. Let's contrast that with multipolarity. In multipolarity, the logic is to minimize threats. Not only might you end up in a war with a declining state, but you might engender a counterbalancing coalition. You might need the declining state as an ally in the future. Multipolarity encourages any given actor to act with caution and restraint and produces what I call a profound desire to support a declining great power to avoid paying these very profound costs. Everyone's with me so far? I see the heads nodding. It's always a good sign. Well, this only tells you about predation or support. It doesn't tell you about the degree. And that's where posture comes in. By military posture, I simply mean, can the declining state deploy military assets to secure itself, to defend itself, relative to a rising state's capacity to threaten that security? And I distinguish between two types of postures here. You have robust postures, where a declining state has the capabilities and the access to defend its interests. And you have weak postures, where there aren't enough assets or there's no access. Very crude categorization schemes that's rooted in the logic of deterrence. Can I defend something or can't I? But critically important, posture varies the role of posture varies depending upon the polarity of the international system. This is not standard in the IR literature for those of you who've taken IR 101. As I argue, weakness in bipolarity encourages the most extreme forms of predation. As I said, bipolarity encourages a rising state to try to eliminate a declining state. It's only kept in check by the threat of war. As a result, if the declining state can no longer protect itself, if it's militarily weak, the rising state can not only eliminate the declining state without fear of the consequences, as a profound desire to do so. That leads to policies of extreme predation. On the other hand, provided the declining state can threaten unacceptable harm and threaten to defend itself against a rising state's predatory efforts, the rising state is kept in check. It has to calculate, it has to accommodate that fear of war. And why pay the cost of conflict if it can just wait over time and wait for the declining state to weaken further? Robust military postures and bipolarity encourage moderate predation. Now this flips in multipolarity. In multipolarity, weakness encourages the most extreme kinds of support. As I mentioned a while ago, in multipolar systems, rising states both want to avoid engendering counterbalancing coalitions and preserve the declining state as an ally in the future. Well, if a declining state is incredibly weak, preying upon that declining state is a terrible signal to other states, right? It encourages them to flock to the declining state's side. And likewise, if at that time I, a rising state, eliminate the declining state, that's when I'm not going to be able to have the declining state as an ally. As a result, to preserve the ally and to prevent counterbalancing, I, as a rising state, have a desire, have an incentive to engage in extreme support. And then finally, with robust postures in multipolarity, we expect to see moderate support strategies. Again, I might want to preserve a declining state as an ally. I might want to avoid engendering counterbalancing coalition. But at the same time, a strong state, a militarily strong declining state in multipolarity, I have no reason to come to the state's aid. I can have the declining state as an ally in the future. It looks like it can protect itself. And if it's militarily strong enough to protect itself, if I ally with it now, I might end up being entrapped into a war, being chain-ganged into a conflict. Why not wait to see how things are going to net out, whether grabbiness will occur by other states, and just play for time? Moderate support is the result. So this gives us the holy grail of the 2x2 yet again, where we see bipolarity and weakness encouraging extremely predatory strategies, such as US-Soviet relations in 1990, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We have bipolarity and robust postures encouraging moderate predation, such as US-Soviet relations in 1989. We have multipolarity and weak postures leading to extreme support strategies, the lower right-hand corner. And we have multipolarity and robust postures causing moderate support strategies. Again, Anglo-American relations in 45-47, before NATO forms, is the epitome of this. So, how am I going to test this? Well, I look at relative decline in Europe after 1945, after World War II. And I do this in order to get the most policy traction, right? There's probably a lot of interest in studying the decline of the Ottomans, or the decline of the Greeks, or the decline of the Byzantine Empire. But why not go for a period where states look like states, they have lots of resources at their disposal? Let's look at post-1945 Europe to get a handle on this. And I code decline on the basis of rapid, large, and sustained relative losses by one great power relative to others. And that's my definition for coding purposes. We can get into that more in Q&A if you want. Now, when you apply this definition, you wind up with two great cases of post-World War II decline. The decline of the United Kingdom after World War II from 45 to 49, and the decline of the USSR from 1989 to 1991. And by looking at these cases, I'm not just examining their decline, I'm looking at the behavior of rising states, the US being one of the rising states that's constant across cases. So by looking at these cases of post-World War II decline, I am able to leverage detailed processes from American diplomatic history to get traction on this policy question. Everyone's with me so far? So my cases, by doing this research, I'm able to tease out causal mechanisms and sequences of events to evaluate the causal logic of the two theories. I'm able to trace out the perceptions of decision makers to make sure my arguments actually track with how policymakers think. And finally, I'm able to expand the points of observation, not just looking at the post-war declines as one or two cases, but by tracing the events over these 2 or 3 or 4 year windows, generating many points of observation. And to do this, I've done a lot of archival research. I've collected over 3,000 documents and Freedom of Information Act requests from several presidential libraries, including the one right across the street, the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland, the Truman Presidential Library, the George Washington University National Security Archive, and I think I was the 4th scholar to actually look at the personal papers of Jim Baker at Princeton University. However, the archival record, especially for the Soviet case, is still incomplete. So to supplement it, I went forth to do a fair number of interviews with former policymakers. This is the H.W. Bush National Security Apparatus in about 1990. You can see Brent Scowcroft, Dick Cheney, Jim Baker, Dan Quayle, the usual suspects, right? And the ones in red are the policymakers I was able to speak to and have been able to speak to thus far. I've circled Jim Baker because, again, I wasn't able to speak with him, but I was able to see his personal papers, which is pretty darn close to getting an interview. All this gives me fairly fine-grained traction on the issue. So let me turn to the case itself. Let me turn to one of the cases to prove the argument. And I'm going to study here U.S. foreign policy and the decline of the USSR, really the last great power decline on record. 25 years ago, this year it actually began. Fairly recent in historical terms. So just to remind you what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to explaining how Europe, which looked like this in 1988, ends up looking like this in 1991. How we see not just the Soviet alliance network and Soviet power retract into Eastern Europe, but how the USSR itself collapsed entirely. And I'm going to explain American foreign policy during this process. In fact, explain the interaction between this process and American foreign policy. And to preview what I'm going to find, I'm going to show that the degree of predation, because we're in a bipolar system here, expands and contracts on the basis of posture. In this period, we see it's only 3 years, but we see significant variation in U.S. policy across time and space. At the same time, I'm going to show you that nuances in military policy are absolutely critical to this process. And finally, I'm going to show you that leaders speak in terms that my theory predicts. Just to give you a flavor of Soviet decline, this is the Cold War balance of power in very crude, lumpy terms between the US and the USSR. You can see the balance of power holding fairly constant until the late 80s, when it begins to take a pretty precipitous dive, and then nosedives in the late 80s and early 1990s. And that's the period I'm focused on. So, to again emphasize the point, I'm going to show that there are 3 phases to U.S. strategy. The first phase is one of moderate predation, kicking off in the fall of 1988 and continuing through the whole of 1989. I'm then going to show how American policy turns on a dime and becomes much more extreme in the debates over German reunification in the fall, in the winter, spring, and summer of 1990. And then finally, I'm going to show how extreme predation walks itself back and shifts back to moderate predation in phase 3, going from October of 1990 until the collapse of the USSR itself in December 1991, Christmas Day, 1991. So what have we got? Well, the first phase of American policy is one of moderate predation, going from the fall of 88 to December of 89. This is a period where the U.S. tries to encourage gradual change as cracks begin to appear in the Soviet system in Poland and Hungary. In fact, the U.S. goes so far as to try to preserve communist regimes in power in some of these states. This is a cable from the State Department entitled, "How to Elect Jaruzelski Without Voting for Him, and Will He Stay?" This is an effort actually by the American embassy in Warsaw to keep the communist regime in power. Why? As I'll show you in a minute, we fear Soviet crackdown. In fact, every time an American policymaker goes to Eastern Europe, an American emissary is sent to Moscow to emphasize that we are not trying to ferment unrest and to try to clear the American message to Eastern Europe with Moscow, not because we were desirous of keeping the Soviet Union intact per se, but for fear of the consequences. And as we head into the fall of 1989, as German reunification begins to escalate, they are an American effort to soft pedal reunification. In fact, American policymakers don't even use the term reunification until well after the Berlin Wall falls. And in fact, American policymakers refuse to endorse nascent plans to reunify Germany until going to Moscow and checking with the Soviet leadership. We're trying to encourage slow, steady change in the region. Now, why is this the case? Well, because the Soviets have an incredibly robust military posture at this time. As one policymaker told me, the Soviets could always stop or reverse changes in the region. With almost 400,000 troops in the GDR in East Germany alone, this was no small matter. There were profound worries of a crisis. And I think a quote from the time really gets at the issue. This is a memo written by Brent Scowcroft right after the Berlin Wall falls. And he told H.W. Bush, "Unlike the Ottoman Empire, Moscow's military capabilities have not declined commensurate with the Soviet Union's political and economic changes. This means that the instrument of last resort is still available to the Soviet Union, and there are no guarantees that the Soviet Empire will go quietly into the night. In all the war games over the years, the most convincing scenario for a European Central Front war, that thing we call World War III, has been a Soviet act of desperation rather than of calculation, a situation in which the vital interests were on the line and not acting was believed in Moscow to be more dangerous than acting." In so many words, American policymakers actively considered how efforts to foment change and roll back Soviet power would be received in Moscow and the consequences thereof. Now, this changes almost overnight. In January 1990 through October of 1990, the United States pursues a policy of German reunification, tries to take the two Germanys, right? East Germany was in the Soviet sphere, the crown jewel of the Soviet Empire, as American analysts refer to it, shove it into West Germany, take the unified state, and shove it into NATO without any concessions to the Soviet Union, without any regard for Soviet equities. In fact, the American desire is such that we structured diplomatic negotiations to isolate the Soviet Union. The 2+4 talks, which Ambassador Napper will happily talk to you about ad nauseum, were explicitly structured by Jim Baker. Oh yeah, yeah. 2+4 talks were structured to prevent the Soviets from getting any concessions from the West, from the West Germans, from the British, from the French. It was designed to isolate the Soviets diplomatically. And when the Soviets came with a bag in hand asking for economic aid in return for German unity, the American policymakers sent them packing. This is a good example. This is a memo written by Bob Hutchings and Robert Blackwell to American policymakers in the National Security Council at the time that talk about the rank-ordered preferences of American goals in 1990. The first one, as you see, is Germany and NATO with forward defense extending to the Oder-Neisse, the German-Poland border, with Allied forces remaining. This was considered almost impossible to get all through 1989. And by October 1990, it's achieved, and not only are American forces remaining, they can deploy nuclear assets onto East German territory. It's an incredible rollback of Soviet power. The central issue in the Cold War is resolved on American terms. Now, why is this the case? Well, because unlike 1989, by 1990, Soviet military posture is weak. The changes in Poland and Hungary and the rest of the Warsaw Pact meant that the Soviets could no longer maintain a conventional military presence in the GDR, meaning that once troops begin to withdraw from the region and political change begins to occur in the region, the Soviets can no longer threaten war with the United States if the US begins to get grabby, unless the Soviets are suicidal and risk all-out nuclear war. This accompanies the fragmentation of the Warsaw Pact. And as Condoleezza Rice, then the leading Soviet analyst in the National Security Council, put it in January 1990, "I believe that the Soviets will not even threaten the Germans." This is in reference to an American effort to reunify Germany within NATO. Within 6 months, if events continue as they are going, no one would believe them anyway. The Soviet credibility to use force to maintain the status quo is gone, which leads to American expansion and the grabbiness of American policymakers. Now you might think, hey, we've just reunified Germany. Cold War's over. Central issue of Cold War Europe is resolved on American terms. Any further decline of Soviet power will be met with American grabbiness and American expansion. That's wrong. After Germany is reunified in October of 1990, we see a sudden retraction of American goals, and all of a sudden American predation walks itself back to moderate predation. This is a time when the Soviet Union itself is beginning to fragment. We have debates over whether the USSR will break up or whether it will remain one country, what's called the center versus republic debates. And in this core debate, the United States sides with the center. It wants to have a weak center, but it does not want to encourage the dissolution of the USSR. In fact, as one of the policy plan documents from the time put it, the president, meaning HW, said in Madrid, "We will deal with what's there." That means we continue to deal with central government institutions on some issues, at the same time building new and more vigorous relationships with the republics. In so many words, rather than encourage the dissolution of the USSR, avowed American policy from the president on down is to keep the USSR together in some way. And this takes on a further flavor, where the US begins to provide conditional and limited economic aid, but still some degree of economic aid. And as Soviet decline and as the collapse of the Soviet Union appears inevitable in the second half of 1991, there's an effort to encourage what's called the slow, peaceful landing, or the peaceful landing. A slow, gentle effort to dissolve the USSR rather than push to break up the state. Really rather surprising given the push to break up the Warsaw Pact in the prior period. So why is this the case? Well, there are two things that are going on around here. Nuclear issues are a prominent one. I'd be happy to take questions about it in Q&A. But one of the central issues at this time is that so far as maintaining the integrity of the USSR itself is concerned, the Soviets have a militarily robust posture. The Soviets are able to engage in internal repression. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, shifts to the right, which means he's encouraging the rebuild up of Soviet internal military forces. And there are coup concerns at this time where there are worries that Gorbachev may be displaced and his follow-on successors remilitarize the US-Soviet relationship. Not only crack down internally, but perhaps try to extend tentacles back into Eastern Europe. So the US walks back its predation. Why is this the case? Well, as Robert Gates put it, a constant question was how much pressure the system could take without a rightist backlash, which could erase many of the internal and external changes. In other words, the US had to be a little more cautious than in the prior period, precisely because it was unclear how much longer we could count on a USSR being militarily quiescent before building itself back up. So what do we got here? Well, I've argued that the US pursued three different and surprising strategies in a short period of time. We didn't just see a monotonic increase of predation, we saw variation across time and space. And archival research showed that predation expanded and contracted as Soviet military posture changes, just as my theory predicted. And that US leaders argue about US security in line with my theory. So, let me turn to the final issue. Why do we care about any of this? Well, for IR theory itself, and I'll apologize to those of you who care about policy for a second, let me just give you the quick IR theory takeaway. There's a perennial question in realist debates and IR theory debates over whether states maximize power or security. And scholars often go about assessing this by looking at unit-level behavior. My argument hints that there's a way to bridge this divide by bringing in a much finer-grained sense of how systemic figurations of power affect unit-level behavior. That's the IR theory takeaway. Let me talk about policy, though. Well, we can care about this on the one hand for predicting Chinese strategy. My theory, which I've shown I think has some legs to it, suggests that China should be a cautious riser. In a multipolar environment, China should be constrained by fear of losing the US as an ally and engendering a quick, rapid counterbalancing coalition. On the other hand, it's hard to say how China views the world. So maybe China views the world as a bipolar system. Hard to predict this. But even if this is the case, bipolarity might encourage Chinese predation. But the US is exceptionally strong in the air and sea power projection assets that are critical to maintaining a robust military posture in East Asia today, even with the growth of Chinese military power. As a result, even if Chinese leaders see the world as bipolar and might be inclined to push the US from the ranks of the great powers, the US military should be able to deter this type of behavior, the most extreme types of behavior, for a very long period of time. But let me turn this around for a second. We can also think of how this affects American strategy. And here the takeaway is that US policymakers are playing an incredibly strong hand. The US is blessed in some way with potential allies in the region, with a robust military inheritance, and with a potential rising adversary that faces real constraints on its growth both in dyadic terms and in systemic terms. And the best takeaway from all this is that US policymakers should not overreact and not waste the strong hand by overreacting. And so with that, let me take any questions you guys have. This is one of my favorite onion cartoons. Yeah, Gabriella, please.
Judge, could you go back to the diagram that outlined your dependent variable, please?
Sure. You're talking about this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is your dependent variable.
Yes. Actually, let me go to a better one. But yeah, keep.
Well, I think this is a wonderful talk, and one of the questions that we keep on asking, and you're filling in here, so I just want more clarification.
Please.
Is when a state declines and another state rises.
Right.
What is the reason for which a declining state, a rising state will go to war? Because the other state anyway declines.
So right.
So the question is, A is rising,
Right.
B is declining. Why is A going to go to war?
Why would A ever go to
B
war?
goes
Right.
To drain,
Right.
Anyway, goes
There-
down the drain.
I think it's a great question, right? Like the logic is, if I have foresight and I'm a rising state, I should know I'm going to get stronger over time, so why waste the assets going to war today if I can just pocket concessions tomorrow? Well, there's a large literature on this, and I think a lot of the answer hinges on the perception of decision makers. We assume that states are rational if they're farsighted, but that's an assumption. States are often not rational, not farsighted, and it's not irrational under certain circumstances for policymakers, even in a rising state, to think the balance of power may shift against me, either for domestic reasons or for external reasons. The rising state may perhaps recover. I may be evicted from office. I may be facing domestic constraints. It's hard to predict these things. There can be domestic reasons or perceptual reasons that push the situation forward.
And I want just, I'm going to give it to Jason, just quickly to,
Yeah.
because you say that the United States, in your example, the United States seems to be the rising state.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if that, because the the Soviets collapsed in a way, the way we perceive them.
Sure.
So I don't see the decline of the Soviet Union started sometimes in the 70s,
Sure.
actually.
So-
So what is our policy?
Well, okay, so there are two different questions there, right? One is when do we think about the start of the Soviet decline? And the second question is how do we think of the United States as a rising state? Let me take the second one first. I would push back a little bit. The conceptions of rising and declining states are poorly done at all times and in all places, right? It's done in relative terms. I would argue that because I think of rise and decline, and I think policymakers in IR theory and IR theorists think of rise and decline in relative terms, the idea of a rising state has to capture the situation where another rival declines in relative, and you grow in relative terms. Otherwise, the concept has almost no analytic traction. If the concept can't capture the rise of the United States from being one of the two poles in the bipolar system to a period of unipolarity, the concept of rise itself really needs to be reconfigured. And so all I'm arguing for is a dyadic conceptualization right here. But to the first question, when do we think of the decline of the USSR? Well, you're right. The Soviet decline, the Soviet engine of economic and political and military growth begins to sputter in the 1970s. But let's not forget what's going on in the United States in the 1970s. This is not exactly a good time for American power either. And if you look at the Carter and Reagan administration debates, which I did in some detail, they were very much worried about American decline even until the mid-1980s. So the reason I began talking about the decline of the USSR in the late 1980s is precisely because that's when it begins in relative terms from the perception of American policymakers. Jason, you had a question.
Can you go back to the other chart that we had the military posture?
Yeah. You want this one?
Yes. So I think that there are two slippery concepts here.
Right.
One is the declining state's posture, their military posture.
Right.
And the other is extreme and moderate.
Right.
And when I look at posture, and you had that great quote from Scowcroft,
Right.
if you continue reading,
Right. Talks about nuclear.
it talks about nuclear
That's right.
weapons, right? And there's
Yeah, I should have cut that off earlier.
No, it was a very good edit. But he goes on to talk about the beauty of nuclear weapons.
Sure.
And so, in
What does
some
this get at?
respects,
Right.
You know, if you put your Robert Jervis hat on, there's no change in military posture.
Sure.
And the part that really matters. And then, if you ask yourself, what's the difference between extreme and moderate from the perspective of the state that's trying to take advantage of a declining Soviet Union? You could also, an alternative explanation is events on the ground, regardless of what the U.S. did, are what explains the difference between extreme and moderate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just pressing you on
Sure.
the dependent variable and the independent variable. Or not. What do you mean by extreme and moderate, and what's the deal here with nuclear weapons?
Sure.
Why are you giving them short shrift?
Okay, so let me take the nuclear one first, and that's actually easier. If you read the Scowcroft quote in detail, the Scowcroft quote actually says nuclear weapons mean that it's unlikely the USSR is going to wage war, and that's why NATO has to maintain a robust military deterrent.
But does that also apply to us?
You would think so. That's not how policymakers think about it, and there's very little evidence that policymakers thought about it in these terms. Policymakers believed the Soviets were not suicidal, and as a result, nuclear weapons canceled out, and it became a question of the conventional balance.
Suddenly we believe in the stability.
Exactly. I was going to say Glenn Snyder's alive and well. Exactly. That's number one. So to your second question, what's the difference between extreme and moderate, and how do we think about it in conceptual terms? Well, to your question about events on the ground driving you forward, that's fine, except that events on the ground can still be responded to in a multitude of different ways. When the U.S. saw the Soviet Union beginning to break up, it could have said, heck, this is great, let's back Boris Yeltsin and screw Gorbachev, right? That was a perfectly valid position. Some people were advocating for it. Instead, we see policymakers explicitly step back. So that's an empirical answer to a theoretical question. Let me give you the theoretical answer. The theoretical answer is policymakers always have agency, always have choice in terms of how many resources and how much effort and how much momentum to give to certain activities. And the question of, will I do things that will irrevocably quickly change the distribution of power, or will I try to play for time, is the fundamental difference between extreme and moderate.
I just think that sometimes what you code as moderate is actually not choice by the U.S., but rather what happens on the ground. And what you choose as extreme predation is actually not U.S. choice, but just how things turned out.
So
I hate to sound like Jeff Engel here, but
no. I respect your position. I think it's wrong though. I think it's empirically wrong. Look,
then I like being no.
that's fine. But look, the U.S. made several key decisions in 1989 to 1991. One I mentioned with the USSR in terms of backing Gorbachev against the republics. That was an explicit choice that sided decisively with certain arguments in the U.S. policy apparatus. What about German reunification? The thing I'm calling extreme predation here. Well, you have to remember, Gorbachev, Mitterrand, the president of France, and Margaret Thatcher were all advocating for keeping the two Germanys apart. In fact, Thatcher, and one of the great, I love Britain in many ways because they're so, perfidious. They're so tongue-in-cheek. In fact, in October of 1989, Thatcher flew to Moscow, met with Gorbachev, had a very nice conversation, cup of tea, some vodka. Then she goes, hey, note taker, please step out of the room. The note taker said, okay. Didn't really step out of the room. She then goes, so if Germany tries to reunify, we cool and allying against that policy? Right? Here's the principal American ally talking to the principal adversary going, hey, are we cool not letting this thing the U.S. wants to happen? Kind of a shocking turn of events. And the note taker, of course, left the room, then wrote it all down because he's not stupid. The point of all this is that in 1990, there's a very plausible counter-coalition that says, I'm going to keep Germany apart, and German reunification doesn't have to be German reunification. U.S. policymakers debated between these two options, and they chose to side with the Germans against the French, the British, and the Soviets. It was a conscious policy choice. So what I'm calling extreme predation, I actually don't think is driven by events on the ground, but so much as conscious calculations. So I'm sorry to continue giving empirical answers to a theoretical question, but these are very conscious choices. Yeah, Jessica, please.
I'm wondering how sticky the concepts of bipolarity and multipolarity are.
Right.
So I think this is problematic for the argument if it is not entirely sticky, in the sense that if a rising power is going to use moderate predation against a robust declining power,
Right.
and it takes a really long time, and
For-
in the interim we shift to a multipolar
Right.
world.
Right. It's a
maybe
real problem.
Rather extreme predation,
Right.
have an uncertain but a risky but potential chance at unipolarity,
Right.
than the multipolar.
Right. In other words, does the fear of a different world arising act itself as a driver? Right. Are they actually thinking about it in terms of polarity? It's a real good question. I don't find much evidence for that argument. Right. It's a legitimate prediction that I tested for a while. I actually looked at some other non-U.S. cases, and there's very little evidence that the concern that the world isn't going to go a certain way acts itself as a driver. They're pretty much convinced that these worlds are fixed for a very long time, and this is what drives them forward. In fact, if you want to take it a step further, the U.S. doesn't even believe the USSR is going to collapse Want to guess when? Anyone want to take a shot at this? October 1991. So pretty much the USSR has to be bleeding out on the ground with republics asking to be independent before the US believes bipolarity is going to end. So these things are actually much stickier than not, and I think your concern's a really good one, but I don't think the empirics bear it out.
So this is all about perceptions, right?
This is both about perceptions and kind of, well, it gets tricky because the quantitative data is done on an annual basis and these things are changing very rapidly. So there's both objective and a perceptual aspect to it. I'm trying to get the match between the two. Yeah, Alexia, I saw your hand up.
Shifrinson, as I can see, your strategy is about one state against another, but what is going to happen if we, for example, add several more states, like in the present day world, we had European Union and Russia. How the United States should deal simultaneously with several powers, which are at the same time, which may be declining or rising?
Sure. Well, number one, the EU isn't a state. I just want to, I'll air my bias there. It's a political union of some kind. It's not really a state. But the point's still there, right? Because we could substitute India, Japan, Russia for these various actors that I'm talking about. But there I simply argue we're back to multipolarity. And if the US is trying to deal with them, they're trying to deal with each other. If they're big enough to affect the US, they're big enough to affect each other. In which case the calculations that I presume to occur into multipolarity will occur, which is I'm actually more sanguine than not. Right? I actually think multipolarity of this type would encourage Japan to hedge against India, China to hedge against Japan, and the US can sit on the sidelines and play Machiavelli and just tease them out against each other. I'm sanguine about those consequences.
And so what should the US do with Russia?
What should the US do? You're asking in what sense?
Well, do you consider Russia a rising power nowadays?
No. No, I do not.
And should then the US do something to make China and Russia hedge against each other?
If Russia is rising and if China is rising, my inclination is to say they will deal with each other independent of whatever the US does. Remember, they share that nice long land border. They don't have a happy history along that land border. These are not good conditions for long-term sustained Sino-Soviet or Sino-Russian cooperation. So I'm sanguine about that consequence. The best the US can do is to keep its hands clean and let the cards fall as they may.
So it is going to happen itself?
I would argue, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Larry, please.
Josh, this is a really elegant theory. I just wish we had one like this.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure we did.
Okay.
Because, I think that there was an awful lot of, as Jason suggests, reaction to events.
Oh, yeah.
Let me give you an example. You say that the U.S. Adopted in, I'd say, January 1990,
Sure.
a posture of extreme predation with the 4+2. And
Right.
and
Right.
Well, I mean, I think that was driven as much by coal as by anything else.
Sure.
In other words, I don't, and you've just consulted the documentary record again, but I don't remember any big disposition to move to German unification until Kohl forced the administration's hand.
Sure.
His 10-point declaration.
Oh, yeah.
They were saying, we are going for, now then there was a conscious decision.
Sure.
Because the president had to decide, all right, are we going to back Kohl?
Or
are
not.
we going to back all these skeptics?
Right.
And he did at that point decide to back Kohl. But if Kohl had not gone out there
Sure.
with his 10-point plan and said, I'm going for German reunification, I'm not sure the administration would have come up with that as a strategy.
So, Larry, I actually agree with you in more than it might appear. But I would argue that the distinction can be thought about in these terms, right? Kohl puts out, so the Berlin Wall falls on 9 November 1989. There's a 3-week grace period. Then Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, puts out what's called a 10-point plan for reunification on 28 November. Doesn't consult the U.S. Scares the bejesus out of the administration because he actually clears it with the Soviets.
They could have stopped him and would have.
Right. But for 5 days after that plan was announced, the U.S. didn't endorse it. It actually spoke with Gorbachev before endorsing the plan and clearing it with Gorbachev. So there's a moment where the U.S. decides to push with Kohl, but it clears everything with the Soviets first. But we can contrast that with what occurs in the winter. That's November '89. Let's contrast that with what occurs in January, February, March of 1990. At that point in time, Kohl is still acting as if he might be willing to offer the Soviets concessions, right? Yet the U.S. consciously calls Cole into Camp David in February of 1990 and tells him, the U.S. will back you if you agree not to offer the Soviets concessions and put the reunified Germany in NATO. So whereas in the first period, the U.S. is hesitant to act until it consults with Gorbachev, in the second period, it's actually pushing Cole farther than where Cole wanted to go. And it's that difference that I'm trying to tease out. Oh, Ryan, please.
Yeah, a little like Larry, I guess I come out of a world that doesn't quite
Think in these terms.
fit into 4 neat boxes.
Sure.
One thing we haven't talked about, of course, was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
Right.
Shield Desert Storm.
Right.
August 1990.
Yes, sir.
You know, a period according to your thesis of our extreme
Moderate predation.
Moderate predation.
Yes, sir.
Yet we needed the Russians.
Right. Right.
We had to get those Security Council votes.
Absolutely.
One after the other.
Right.
Because of Bush 41's
Yes.
interaction with Gorbachev. You know, arguably there would not have been a Desert Storm in January of '91
Without that.
if we didn't have that Security Council vote that the President could then take to
Right.
American Congress.
Right.
So it just seems to me a little more nuanced.
Oh, I apologize if I'm being too glib and too general. What I would argue, and I actually entirely agree with you, and we see in the documents incredible concern that if the U.S. isn't nicer to the USSR, that we will not get the votes for Desert Storm, and that will upset the entire ballgame for the reasons you just very nicely laid out. Again, though, I'm trying to explain management of the USSR in Europe, and what Desert Storm does, it focuses attention on the Middle East and away from Europe. Europe is kind of put on hold while Desert Storm goes forward. And so, whereas I frame this as October of 1990 through December of 91 as one of moderate predation, I would actually argue that there is kind of a bracket period from August of 1990 until February of 91 where everything goes to hell in a handbasket for these idiosyncratic on-the-ground reasons. But once the U.S. begins devoting attention again to Europe, we see these tendencies begin to emerge. Again, I'm not arguing, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not arguing that this is how policymakers think and act at all times and in all places. I'm just arguing these are the revealed preferences and real tendencies that emerge over time. Kind of just like Adam Smith talks about the hidden hand of the market sometimes, so too do these hidden tendencies kind of emerge under different configurations of power. Please.
Just a two-finger on this.
Please.
I think you could do two things to really help yourself.
Okay.
One is to show a timeline
Right.
of these different periods. And on the bottom of the timeline, I would show changes in Soviet capabilities, because the key to your argument is, can the Soviets resist?
Right.
Right? That has to be the answer.
Right.
It's more than just the claims. You care about their posture, because
Right.
can they
Resist. That's
predation?
exactly right.
So you should show that on the bottom, right?
Hmm.
And then
Highlight it as we go along.
as we go
Yeah,
along,
yeah.
because there's a lot going on here. Right?
Oh, yes.
The Gulf War, Helmut Kohl running ahead of these things, but the beauty of your argument is you're trying to simplify something that's really complicated by highlighting the Soviet ability to resist.
That's
How
exactly.
that varies over time.
Right.
And you're trying to show those in fine-grained details.
Right. I appreciate that. That's a really good idea. I have not thought about it before. It's really quite. Larry, Ambassador Crocker, did I answer your questions fully? I mean, I don't want to give it short shrift.
No, let's take some more questions.
Okay.
And I would simply say that is a very big bracket.
Yes, no, it's a huge bracket, and I'm very uncomfortable just bracketing it. It's a trick. Dominic, please.
So I want to preface this by saying I'm drinking from the fire hose a little bit, so it's very possible that I missed this or I'm just being incredibly naive. Is there a variable, or does it matter, or does it matter at all, sort of a role of domestic politics?
Sure. So,
And did I miss that?
no, so domestic politics could apply in one of two ways, right? It could either be U.S. domestic politics driving the U.S. to do something, or changes in Soviet domestic politics affecting American
So
calculations.
I'm thinking in either
Either A or B.
United States,
Sure.
does it matter?
Right.
And I can think of it in two ways. That sometimes you may want to be more aggressive because you're actually not that strong, so
Right.
there's a way to sort of build.
Sure, it's kind of like diversionary war type arguments, right? I'm weak at home, I'm facing pressure, so I go abroad to seek demons to slay to reunify the homeland. It's actually the opposite. The period of greatest fractionality in the greatest factionalization in the U.S. is the first half of 1989. Democrats control Congress, and Bush is being roundly criticized for not doing enough to support Poland and Hungary. But that's actually the period where you see the most U.S. restraint. It's the period where the prediction would be we see the most aggression precisely to overcome domestic critics, and that's when Bush is the least forward-leaning in some sense. I'll give you a funny story. Bush is dragged kicking and screaming into supporting what's called the SEED program for Poland. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for, but humor me for the time being. He's dragged kicking and screaming. The budget goes from $350 million to support democracy in Poland and Hungary to $1.2 billion at the behest of Congress. So it's actually, he's trying to keep it in check, and he's being pulled along into more engagement with the region.
Because I could easily see another 2x2.
Sure.
I think in terms of high support, low support, and then aggressive, not so aggressive,
Right.
and there would be different situations in which people could
Right.
respond.
Well, for better, worse, or indifferent, Congress or domestic pressure in general is being surprisingly, it's inhibiting him very little. It's forcing his hand in any direction very little. Basically, the American public is confronted with a paradigm shift, right? We're used to the Cold War. We're not used to, and now what do we do with the post-Cold War world? So there's really no consensus that's compelling Bush to respond in any given way. So those constraints, which often exist, are now removed. Yeah.
You said phase 3 in the U.S.-Soviet relations was moderate predation, right?
Yep.
Could you go to that slide? I want to make sure I saw what I think I saw.
Which one do you want? Do you want this, or do you want the explanation?
Right here.
Okay.
Isn't it, when you had your breakdown of what behavior to expect, conditional limited economic
Right.
fell under
Yes.
moderate support.
Yep.
So I'm confused with the difference between moderate predation and moderate support.
I could cheat and say that's a typo. Is that Ian? Do you have a follow-on?
I do. I was
Okay, let me take both.
maybe you add the definition further in your brief, but I'm something. If you slightly on the concept of predation, the definition, your definition of predation.
Okay.
If it's moderate predation, is it inherently moderately supporting them as well?
Sure.
If you're having a physical breakdown?
So I should be clear about, okay, so there's an empirical issue, there's a conceptual issue. Let me do the empirical first. When I say conditional limited economic aid as a type of predation, it's because of the conditions imposed. The conditions imposed are that Gorbachev will slowly devolve power to the Soviet republics, all of which is to weaken the central authorities. So this is a type of economic aid that actually serves a strategic great power, change the balance of power purpose. So that's just that's an empirical aberration, but the concept is still there. The question of what is predation, how does moderate predation differ from moderate support is alive and well. Predation is shifting the balance of power in one's favor as opposed to slowing or stopping changes in the balance of power, which is support. So that's the conceptual difference. This is an effort to slowly shift the balance of power in your favor, which is a type of moderate predation that's different than slowly trying to halt change the balance of power, which is support. So I still think there's a big difference there, and I feel that even though this is economic aid, which would normally fall under supportive strategies, the way in which this was phased and structured hints at the moderate predatory nature of it. Hey, Gabriella, please. I think this will have to be our last question, I'm guessing. Please.
I don't want to destroy the beauty of the diagrams and everything.
That's all right.
But I wonder if, going back to Jason's observation, you don't have there an intervening variable between the independent variable and your dependent variable, and the intervening is nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
That actually you can define it as
Sure.
an intervening variable, and then that goes and determines your type of strategy.
Well,
Because if the state doesn't have any nuclear weapon, you may be more predated.
sure. Like if the state doesn't have the ability to nuclear retaliate, do you see more predation or not? It's possible. I would actually probably predict that as true. But that doesn't change the fact that the incentive and the overall behavior is in this direction, and that we're talking about conditional variation given nuclear weapons. I think the framework can be applied, accounting for the influence of nuclear weapons. Yeah, Larry, please.
Just a quote on the nuclear issue.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 1991, the primary fear that was driving everyone was precisely this question of the nuke.
Right.
Nuke.
Loose nukes. Right.
Right. As we saw Gorbachev weaken, you know, he loses Yeltsin wins the Russian Republic,
Right.
Russian presidency election in June. The coup is in August. And
Right.
then everybody, I can remember just being terrified that night because who's got the
Right.
Who's got the Chimamanda?
That's absolutely right. Who's got the bombs? Right.
And so a lot of this back off was to try to find some way to be sure that those launch codes didn't migrate.
Absolutely. And I don't want to underplay the role of nuclear anarchy, nuclear anarchy fears as a constraining factor here. And I actually would expect there's a whole different project to be written about how nuclear anarchy influences, the fear of nuclear anarchy influences calculations. But if I recall the timeline correctly, because there's actually there's a working group headed by Condi Rice called the Soviet Collapse Working Group, you know, pretty gutsy title, that forms in December of 1990. And you can trace their documents. The nuclear anarchy fear only really kicks off, as you say, in after the coup of 91, or really October of 91 is when it hits profoundly, because that's when you see my reading of it. Maybe you have a different view. The real fear of imminent collapse hitting.
No, but there are two issues.
Okay.
One is earlier in 1991 is who has control over the Soviet nuclear weapon. By the time you get
Okay.
to October, November, it is okay. We're going to have 4 nuclear powers and not 1.
Sure. Okay.
That's
Sure.
the difference.
So my final word on this, because I think we're over time, is to say, in the first half of 91, that only reinforces my argument further, right? The fear of who controls the nuclear arsenal and therefore who controls Soviet central apparatus and whether they're going to remilitarize and be more aggressive or more, you know, whether they're going to threaten to impose harm all the greater upon the U.S. only becomes all the more of a concern. So I agree with you. This is
What I'm saying is you could maybe work Jason's nuclear thing into this and wind up strengthening your argument.
That'd be great. I think I absolutely need to. It's one of the great holes in the project in its current guise. I don't want to shy away from it.